Welcome back to Research Methods. This is week 6, so we're looking at other methods of primary research. And again, quick reminder, primary research meaning that you guys are the ones actually doing and collecting the data, okay? So what are we doing this week? This week, a few things that were in the news that caught my eye. Then talking about some other types of primary research. Things like observation, experimentation, photo studies, case studies, and just some others. And finally ending up with a bit of on meta-analyses and multiple methods or hybrids. Okay. First off though, in the news, Hurricane Sandy. And just to give you a hint of when I'm recording this, Hurricane Sandy is just right now hitting the eastern seaboard. So New York essentially shut down, New York Stock Exchange shut down, and sometime over the next day, going to find out how bad it has hit the eastern seaboard. But like many things in the world today, a lot of connections going on between there and the rest of the world, particularly North America. So air travel all across the continent and around the world being affected. Next, earthquake off Haida Gwaii. 7.7 on the Richter scale, recorded off the coast of British Columbia. And tsunami warnings were issued across BC, Hawaii, I believe up to Alaska and down the western seaboard of the continent. But tsunamis weren't an issue this time. But a quick reminder of just how interconnected things are again, and the need for British Columbia to be ready for the next potential earthquake. U.S. election in 1 week, and that's going to have some broad implications and impacts for the United States and the world when it comes to everything from the economy, cross-border travel, shopping, everything. So stay tuned. And finally, something that I noticed was there was a strike at Air France, but because there were so few people that were involved in the strike, it actually had little or no effect. So one of those rare times where a strike at an airline really didn't affect things. Okay? Again, if you guys ever see some news stories that you want to share with the class, hey, let us know. Alright, observation research. We've been looking at, and I'm sure most of you, normally when you're thinking about primary research, you're thinking about, your typical things of focus groups and interviews, surveys, questionnaires, things like that. But I just wanted to make sure that you guys are thinking also about some different ways and some other ways of doing your research. Observation research can be really useful if you want to just see what people are actually doing. It's a way of just being as objective as you can, recording, watching, seeing what people are doing, and getting a sense of, human behavior. You can answer a lot of good research questions. Some of the things that I really like and that are really useful about observation research is that you're watching people as they're actually acting, as they're behaving. So there's no people having to recall what they did at a certain time, certain day. There's if it's done right, if it's done unobtrusively, you can get people's real reactions rather than their politically correct, socially acceptable actions. And in the field, and sometimes even in somewhat artificial conditions, you can get a real sense of how people react and what they're going to do in certain situations. And as I state there, it can be a good complementary bit of information to other types of research or other research that you're doing. Some of the things to watch out for, though, is that it's not necessarily an easy process. There's a lot of things that you need to do properly beforehand and during and after in order for it to be useful, valid information. Observation research can give you some of that sort of what's going on, but it's never going to get you into the head of the person. It's never going to tell you why the person is reacting the way that they are. And if that is important to your research, then you're really going to have to talk to them. If any of you are planning on using observation research, there are some ethical implications to think about. You are essentially spying on somebody. So there are some considerations there. It can be time consuming. You're trying to watch these people real time, so depending upon how long these behaviors generally take and time between behaviors, it can be a time-consuming process. So, it's not something you enter into lightly, but in certain situations, for certain types of research, it can be very useful. Quite often, you'll notice that observation research is done for more exploratory stuff, just to get a general sense of what's going on, may be used to build a bit of a framework or a bit of an understanding of a situation prior to more quantitative stuff. But it can give you some incredible information, such as, understanding that shoppers tend to purchase things more at eye level than above or below their normal line of sight. Or watching people as they walk into a store and understanding which direction they're going to turn naturally. So, that sort of thing. A couple of things that are important to understand, or a couple of dimensions that you need to know when you're doing observation research, is how much structure or formality you're going to do when you're collecting the information. And the other side of it is how much participation there is by the person actually collecting the information. Sometimes you might be strictly, watching from above, almost a satellite view, watching the situation, versus full participation and actually participating in the process and observing at the same time. So those are kind of your two extremes and various levels and degrees within that. With that sort of participant observation, or collecting data while you're part of the whole process, or while the person recording is part of the whole process, this can be very difficult and it takes a lot of skill and preparation beforehand for it to be done well. For ethical reasons, it's generally important that all the rest of the group members are aware of your role in the whole process, but that doesn't necessarily, and that won't necessarily change how people react, especially the longer that the researcher is a part of the whole process. I tend to find that the more people forget about your role in the whole process. However, there is that cautionary part, especially right at the start, where you need to make sure that that person does not change those natural behaviors. So, The nice thing about that sort of participant observation is that by being a part of the process, you get to see it more from what would be kind of an emic, or seeing it through the eyes of the respondents. You're part of the whole process. You're better able to understand why they're doing what they're doing while they're doing it, instead of trying to do it completely removed from the whole process. Some of the things that you might record if you are doing this sort of observation research: the physical setting, what's the environment like? Who's involved in the whole process? What are those people doing? Other things that seem to be affecting, or that might be affecting, the whole process. That could be simple objects, a table, chair, TV, door, whatever the case may be, whatever could be affecting the whole process. Also important to note things like if there's a particular occasion or situation, similar to what we were talking about when you were doing surveys and that, if there is something special going on, it's important to record that and note that in case that does have an effect on your data. Sometimes it's important to note what happened when, as far as sequence. So, walking in the door and then going to the chair and then the table, or the table and then the chair. The order of events is sometimes important. And finally, things like the goals or feelings of the actors, which of course you generally don't collect until you've spoken with the person afterwards, because really by just watching it, you seldom know what the goals and feelings of the people are. Now, a few things you need to be watching out for that could affect and kind of bias your observations. Things like selective attention. So, especially after you've been doing it for a while, you might only be picking up on certain things and watching for certain things to occur, and maybe you've got an idea that one particular aspect or one particular thing is causing the behavior that you're looking for, so you start to watch just for that particular thing to occur, and every time, oh, yep, saw it again, oh, saw it again. While you're doing that and maybe selectively picking out certain things, you might be forgetting others. So really important for you to stay objective. Selective encoding, kind of similar to selective attention, but this time where you start just categorizing certain actions, certain behaviors in a particular way every time. And needing to be very careful that, again, you keep an open mind throughout the process. A selective memory. Now this deals more with, after a while you might start forgetting some of the details, and that's why it's important, as much as possible, to record things as soon after you've observed them as possible. So even if necessary, doing some quick audio notes, which is actually very handy and very easy to do nowadays with things like phones and that have that recording ability. Another possible bias, interpersonal factors. Now this interpersonal that I'm talking about can be both directions, from the researcher to the person that's being observed, and vice versa. Once you start getting involved in a process, your personal involvement, you may not want to record, or consciously or subconsciously want to record certain observations. You may either become particularly harsh or particularly kind on people once you're more emotionally involved in a process. The other side of that is once the person knows that they're being observed and maybe they care about you or your research, they may start reacting differently than they would have if you hadn't been there. So again, you know, your personal involvement, you need to be careful that it isn't impacting on your research. Important when you're doing your observation research that you've got a bit of a coding scheme. And by coding scheme, that's a way of, objectively recording and keeping track of the different behaviors, some way of being able to objectively look at and analyze the observations afterwards. Granted, they are qualitative and they're moderately open, but you still need some way to code them and to record and to understand and work with this information. And your textbook covers a few points and things to consider for coding. When you're coding behaviors, there's kind of, three, and these aren't mutually exclusive, but three things to consider, three dimensions to consider when you're doing this coding. There's what's called event coding, and that's where you're wanting to record a particular event that occurs. You might be recording the number of times something occurs. For example, the number of times that people drop garbage onto the ground as they're starting off on a hiking trail. Or the number of people that, when they walk in the door of your hotel, turn right instead of turn left. Things like that. State coding, kind of in difference to that, what you're recording there is the number of times that a certain condition is occurring or a certain state. And when that state does occur, how long that occur or that state is active for. And I give the example, how often you have more than 5 people in your lineup and how long that condition of 5 or more people in your lineup goes for. And that can be, your measure of service at whether it's, a restaurant or hotel or whatever the case may be. Another thing to consider is what's called interval coding. And what interval coding does is you're breaking up your research day or your research period into blocks of time. And then you're recording certain events, certain things, potentially certain states within each one of those intervals. So, maybe within every 15 minutes, you want to record how many people there are standing around in your lobby. And so it's a good way of breaking apart your observations into bite-sized chunks. You may also, with that sort of interval coding, record how often every 15 minutes, how many vehicles are in your parking lot. Again, it becomes a nice, convenient way to keep track of your recordings and to be able to analyze them afterwards. Now, aside from observation, another type of primary research that some of you might consider, and it's actually something that I was doing with my research, is experimentation. Now, experimentation can be very difficult. So it's generally not something that I would tend to recommend to people, at least not a full-on, statistically significant, blah, 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 research perfect experiment. to better explain that, you know, if you're just doing things for your own purposes, experimenting can be a fabulous way to figure out what works and what isn't working, and give you a sense of, maybe some of the what's going to work better, and just to trial out things before you go too far down a path. When you're thinking about experimentation, essentially, pure experimentation, what you're doing is, in a situation, you try to control everything, or as much as possible, except for this one thing that you're changing, or you're manipulating, or you're doing something different with one single thing, and that's called your independent variable. And then you're measuring, the effect, the impact on something else, or some things else, some other things. And that would be your dependent variable. So, give an example. Possibly you're thinking about putting up some new signage in your hotel, some new signage in your restaurant, whatever the case may be. Before you go, and especially nowadays, this is actually relatively easy with the software and printers and everything that are out there. Before you go and spending heaps of money on brand new signage, possibly you try out, a few different messages, a few different graphics, things like that, and you put them up into your hotel or your restaurant, and you see whether or not certain types of signs in certain locations and things like that have more or less effect on how people are going to react. Something else that you can try is things like a point of sale change. And if you want to experiment whether or not changing something at your point of sale will affect things like additional sales. And for any of these sorts of experiments, if you're doing them for your own purposes again, it's not as critical whether or not everything is perfectly done, as long as you're getting some good information, and in the end it's saving you money. Another type of primary research, something called photo studies. Now with photo studies, as the name kind of suggests, what you're doing is you've got pictures and you're using them in your research. And there's kind of two different major ways or major types of photo studies that you'll come across. One is called respondent photography, and that's essentially getting people to take pictures, whether you're telling them to take pictures or you're just borrowing some of their pictures, and you're interpreting what they're taking pictures of, where they're taking these pictures, things like that. And by that, you get a sense of how people are visiting your location. You get a sense of what's important to people and why these things are important. And you just get to better understand kind of the thinking and understanding of visitors. Another way of using photos or pictures in your research is something called a photo sort. And with a photo sort, what you're doing is you're presenting these pictures that you want to do the research with to the participants in the research. And you get them to move the pictures around, to put them into groups and things like that, and to try to understand what these pictures mean and what these groups mean to the participants in your research. For that sort of thing, for example, you might want to be able to understand, and this is how we've used them, or I've used them before, to understand which pictures most represent, for example, Canada. And by presenting people with pictures, various locations around Canada, and getting them to show us, okay, which of these pictures mean something about Canada to you, which of these pictures kind of mean something about Canada to you, and which of these do you not make any connection whatsoever with Canada. We got to understand what people think about Canada. And then we were able to do some further work with that, and it helped us understand which pictures we should be including in our marketing. Not only that, but if there was aspects of those pictures that we were hoping people would understand and connect with Canada, and there was no connection, it also made us wonder whether or not we needed to start doing a better job of marketing those aspects, or if possibly those were areas that would take too much work and weren't worthwhile including within our marketing. Okay, so photo sorts and photo studies can be very useful. Case studies are something else that many of you might have heard of before. You'll go through a lot of case studies in that quite often in education. Some of the universities very often will use case studies in various courses. And case studies, you're looking at either a particular subject, person, organization, something like that, maybe an event, and trying to understand it as best you can in a whole and complete fashion. And by that, draw some connections and understanding that might be applicable for other similar situations. Now, these are some typical types of case studies. There's the individual case study, where you're looking at a particular person. Fairly famous people have had case studies, especially fairly famous business people have had case studies done about them, their management styles, how their management style affected the organizations that they worked for, things like that. You might have a set of individual case studies where you've got a group of individuals, or you've got a group of companies that you're looking at that all have some similarities, but also it's useful to have in these sort of group case studies some differences between the organizations. And by examining several organizations at the same time, it may help you understand what factors and what makes one successful and another one not successful. You may have a case study of a community, one or more local communities, what's working, what isn't working, why. Again, trying to understand what is it about a successful community versus one that isn't successful, and in hopes of possibly taking those learnings and applying them in other situations. You also will sometimes have case studies of events or relationships. A lot of things like, for example, the Olympic Games, the Winter Olympics, where you'll see case studies of them to understand how they worked, who did what, everything like that. So case studies are fairly typical, more qualitative understanding of situations and trying to understand what's going on just to better explain and, again, apply those to other situations. a typical case study, you'll have a quick overview, kind of the background behind what's going on in the project, what's going on behind the situation. The main procedures, what you're doing, when, where, why, how, who is spoken with, things like that. Some key research questions, and then the reporting of the situation and the analysis and discussion. A few other types of primary research I just wanted to highlight with you guys. Unobtrusive measures. Now, this is something that some of you may not even think about, but you can get a lot of really good information just based on your surroundings. Now, this may be kind of a funny connection to make, but, think about Sherlock Holmes and the sort of connections and understanding that Sherlock Holmes can make of a situation without doing a single thing. Well, not wanting to say that any of you need to be a Sherlock Holmes, but you can gather a lot of really good information just by observing your environment. Taking a look at the wear patterns on the floor of your business can tell you a lot of where people are spending the majority of their time. There's this particular university that I've read about that for the first year of after it was built, or a particular area of it was built, they put absolutely no paths in that particular area. And what they did was they just waited until people walked in that area, they observed the wear patterns on the ground, and then when they noticed where people were actually walking, they put some very key strategic paths in those areas. Basically hardened those key paths, and that way they knew that people would be sticking to these paths, and these would be where people needed the roads. Other things to notice, things like where garbage tends to be deposited, and possibly the need to put a garbage can there, or even the types of garbage that people are depositing in a certain area, which can tell you, believe it or not, where people are typically coming from before coming to your area. Things like taking the radio setting from rental cars so that you understand which radio stations the people that are renting these cars are listening to. With that sort of understanding that chances are, especially for any of the longer term rentals, the last station that's on that car was the station that they were listening to. So you know who these people, what radio station these people that were renting the vehicle were listening to. Terrific information if you're a tourism organization to know which radio stations are being listened to by the tourists. So there's lots of different things, lots of different ways, lots of different possibilities when you're trying to understand what people are doing. Content analyses. Now, one of you had thought about or was thinking about content analyses, and these content analyses can be very useful. It tends to be kind of a combination of qualitative and quantitative analyses. And what you can do with some of these sort of content analyses is just get an understanding of, people's thoughts, people's ideas, getting a sense of, what's important to people. Now, typically, these content analyses tend to work with, what people are saying or doing, writing down. you know, maybe the sort of comments that they're writing in a comment book about your place, and getting a sense of how often certain words are being said. So that's the, some of that sort of quantitative, but also the intent or the sort of way that those words are being used, that qualitative aspect of the content. When you're going to do a content analysis, and again, some of this is becoming a little easier with computers, and you can actually get some computer programs that will do content analyses to a point for you. They're not perfect, but they do help. But then again, even doing a Word document with the content and doing word counts and things like that can give you some information. But very clearly defining what words, what phrases, what you're looking for, how you're going to analyze it, things like that. Setting up some very clear constructs so that there's some objectivity behind what you're doing, and then carrying it out. Verbal protocols, while this is, I guess, kind of like content analyses, they're a little bit different because instead of people just freely, providing the content or maybe answering questions and things like that, a verbal protocol is slightly different because what you're getting the person to do is you're actually getting them, while they're doing something, to explain what's happening, why they're doing it, what's happening next, what are they thinking, everything like that. For example, you may get somebody to go through the steps of booking a trip, whether it's over the phone or through an online site, things like that. And as they're going through each step of booking that trip, they explain what they're looking for, why they're looking for it, what they clicked on, why they clicked on, things like that. Every aspect of their procedure. And what that gets you for your research is it gives you a bit of an understanding of what's actually going through their head as they're going through it. A lot of website usage is, at least those initial steps, should be carried out with these sort of verbal protocols, because you can really get a much better understanding of, why did they click on that part of the page? When they were scrolling up and down, what were they actually looking for? When they first went to your website, what was going through their head, and where did their eyes first catch on? It can really give you a sense of what's working, what isn't working, what needs improvement, do things need to get moved around, highlighted, whatever the case may be. It can be a really useful way of understanding things, again, through the eyes of that visitor or the user. Now, somewhat different scale, meta-analyses. Now, while meta-analyses, really, you're not doing primary research in a pure sense of the term, because you're not actually, with a meta-analysis, generally you're not going out there and collecting new data. With a meta-analysis, what you're doing is you're taking the data from several other studies, combining it all together, and then doing one big study. And you'll sometimes hear about this sort of thing in medical fields and things like that, where, maybe they've been studying something for a while here, and maybe they studied it a similar fashion in maybe the United States and Canada and over in Great Britain and some other country. Well, a meta-analysis might take all of those data sets, combine them all together, and then see if things were occurring across all of the studies. And by that, they hope to get kind of a broader understanding of what's going on, see if potentially there is something that might not have been picked up in any one particular study, but seems to be carrying across all of the studies. Something that's being missed by all the different studies, and by doing that one big study of several smaller studies, it gives you that chance to work with a larger sample and a broader cross-section so that you get a much better and much different understanding of the situation. Now, multiple methods, last thing before we finish off, multiple methods is where you're looking at the same thing, the same phenomenon, the same research question, same problem, but from a few different perspectives, a few different viewpoints, a few different ways. And by looking at it from these few different ways, few different viewpoints, what you're hoping is that each one of these different views will give you a different but similar view, similar idea of what the situation is, and just give you much better understanding and hopefully support each other in your findings so that you come to one broad but complete understanding of the situation. Now, that is quite often called triangulation, and you may hear that. Now, sometimes triangulation is used somewhat improperly. Sometimes people try to say, using qualitative and quantitative research at the same time for a problem is triangulation. Strict sense of the term, not necessarily, because unless you're looking at it from different perspectives and using the qualitative and quantitative to look at it from different ways to get at a similar result, then that's triangulation. If you're using them together to just get a more complete understanding, then that isn't really triangulation, because all you're doing is you're using one to give you a better understanding or support the other, not to test whether the other one is actually valid or true. Okay? That's technically what triangulation is more about. But it's still very useful and worthwhile combining qualitative and quantitative research together. So even if you're not doing triangulation, highly recommended. Anyways, thank you very much, guys. In case you're wondering about this picture, this is from a place called Movie World, which is part of Warner Brothers, and it's a theme park on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. And one of those sort of situations, this is a parade, but a good people watching opportunity to see what people are doing, what they're focusing on, what's important to them. Also a good opportunity if you were doing research at this theme park to see which people feel it's important to observe this sort of parade and which people tend to use opportunities like this to ride the rides. They could care less about the parade and they find opportunities like this perfect time to go on the ride because everyone else is going to be drawn to this parade. So as a researcher, you can use opportunities like this to your advantage and gain a lot of understanding about your visitors to an area. Anyways, thank you very much, guys, and take it easy.